Well, welcome for our Thursday evening Zoom, My Solar Story. I'm John Sarber. It says I'm John Freeman, but John Freeman is here also, the real John Freeman. And it's a pleasure to have John Kinch, lots of Johns and the GLREA board, coming tonight to talk to us about community solar. But first, I need to acknowledge our sponsors, the state Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Homeland Solar, McNaught and McKay, Iron Ridge Racking, Harvest Solar, and Shree Energy. And I'd like to, I know that many of you are members of GLREA. If you're not, we would love to have you join us. You can do it online at our website, glrea.org. And it's great to have John Kinch join us tonight to talk about community solar. I've known John for many years. He's the executive director of Michigan Energy Options. He's a member of the GLREA board and just got elected to be our president. And but tonight he's kind of wearing a different hat as a community solar kind of expert. And he has been involved in a number of different projects related to community solar, but kind of one of his real achievements was the community solar project in East Lansing. Actually, just please mute yourself.
I was up on Cripple Creek. I got a picture out now. I hope it turns out. It's a fish hawk.
Let's see. And the community solar project down the road is in the city of East Lansing on a park, an old landfill. And John has set up an LC. He has been the developer of the project and has an LLC that owns the project. The power is sold to the Lansing Board of Water and Light, which provides bill credits to the participants in this community solar project. He's been involved with other aspects of community solar. So without any more information, let me turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, John. And if everybody can just confirm you're seeing a screen. Good, good. Hold on, let me close the door. My dog just walked in on me. Well, thanks for having me. I feel a little bit odd right now because our fourth John with GLREA is not on the call, John Richter, but usually we have our board meetings and there's so much conversation about which John is speaking next that it gets confusing, but we'll work our way through it tonight. So thank you for having me. I want to tell you about a couple of things we do as Michigan Energy Options. Well, you're welcome to read my bio, but I'm going to first pause because I usually don't talk about my PhD in my work, but I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State University with an English major undergraduate and American Studies PhD with a focus on environmental history. And one of my professors, Tess Tavermina, is actually on the call tonight. So we English majors sometimes do okay for ourselves. I want to also, just as you take a look at who I am a little bit, say some of the work that Michigan Energy Options is doing these days. We, by the way, got going in East Lansing by the name of Urban Options back in 1978, and we're the first energy nonprofit of any kind in the state of Michigan. Most lately, we've been doing some interesting projects around renewable energy and also energy planning. We are the consultant to the state of Michigan for their solar projects that they are trying to do, both in front of the meter and behind the meter. If anybody's happened to be out to any of these state parks recently, such as Holland and others, you may see solar. We were the broker of that deal. So what we did is work with the state of Michigan and worked with the solar development community and got that project up and running. We've got another big project up and running, or soon to up and running, in the Upper Peninsula, where we have an office on a former mining site. And just as a side note, I'm a real big believer that we have all sorts of brownfields and landfills that could be great locations for locating our solar. And we take a lot of the consternation out of some of this siting in rural communities, by the way. We're also doing some interesting energy planning. We did a climate action plan for the Traverse City Light and Power. And we also are working right now in the Grand Haven region where I live on a community energy plan. And you can bet that that plan is going to include making some cases for distributed solar. So what's on for tonight? We'll talk about what community solar is. I'll tell you about Michigan Energy Options experience, as John Sarver knows very well, because he was a co-conspirator in getting this going way back when. Put some national and state context around this, talk about policy, and say a word or two about the guidebook, but also importantly, discussion with you. If you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me. You can just turn on your mic, or you can dump something in the chat, and maybe I'd ask one of the Johns just to keep your eye on the chat if there's something that comes up that's a clarifying question for a particular slide that would help out. This is a definition of community solar. It comes from the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's a whopper of a definition. And I have read this many, many times, and we actually are using it in our guidebook. And the more I read it, the more I think yes and no to the assertions it's making as it's trying to define what is or isn't community solar. So if you could just take a minute and take a look at that, I will talk over it a little bit, because I think there's some confusions out there as to what community solar is or isn't. It's one of these terminologies that kind of like sustainability that's been around just long enough for it to become kind of a little bit watered down and perhaps even at times not necessarily sincere as to who's saying it. So one of the hallmarks, I believe, of community solar is that it's something in a relatively concentrated geographic area. And by that, I mean that it's a solar project that lands on the distribution grid. You know, real quick, because you probably all know, we have a system of moving power around in our country in which we have large transmission lines that bring power from great distances. In the past, those have been plugged into coal plants. Now more and more, they're plugged into natural gas plants or big wind farms or solar farms. And then those go onto the distribution grid, and then it goes into your neighborhood, to your service line, to your house. But all community solar projects, at least in our state, aren't necessarily on the distribution grid. They're not necessarily nearby you. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that this definition gets at is meaningful benefits of renewable energy. And I think that's an interesting phrase there. One of the assertions it makes is that it does reduce energy costs, and that's a kind of yes, kind of no, depends how it's structured. Unfortunately, some community solar projects in our state, by the way, are actually an upsell. So you actually pay more money to be a part of a community solar project than paying less money. So that doesn't really, from my mind, meet the definition of what community solar is. An all-important cohort in our communities, low to moderate income households, in theory, can get access to community solar. And that's true in some cases. We have some projects that we've looked into ourselves around the state that the State of Michigan Energy Office has been doing. But awful lot of community solar projects are probably not going to be within reach of an income qualified household. What I will agree is that a community solar park or project is a system of shared solar panels often located within a community. I do agree with that. But subscribing is one thing. Subscribing can be like Netflix. You subscribe to Netflix, you enjoy Netflix, but you don't have any ownership in it. Other models for community solar are actually kind of an equity stake where you actually purchase into a project where you can eventually have a payback and realize some ROI in your investment, a dividend. So community solar is complicated. On the other hand, this is a very nice diagram that sort of spells out the basic way that a community solar project works out. So ideally, you locate a community solar project somewhere in your community on the distribution grid. Ideally, you're also, like I said, locating it in what I would consider marginal lands. A marginal land could be a parking lot. It could be a brownfield, a landfill. It could even be a large flat roof somewhere, like the DPW, which could then allow community members to participate in a project. You need in this model a willing utility to be part of the process, because this is not behind the meter. This is energy that's in front of the meter. And so your utility has to be willing to take that power coming onto its distribution lines. And then ideally you have a utility which is willing then to give you some sort of recognition for this project. Typically it's an on-bill credit. So they would calculate what that energy being produced is worth and give you a modest on-bill credit every month. You are typically involved with the community solar project with the idea that a panel kind of serves as a share, but it's not always that way. In our project, we had kind of a panel which represented kind of a share in a project, but I've seen others in which you can purchase shares that are not necessarily correlated with a panel. So I'll talk about our project that we did in East Lansing, but I also want to let you know that we have a couple other projects that we were involved with in the Upper Peninsula. One of them is in Marquette with the Marquette Board of Light and Power. We were able to convince that utility to go forward with a community solar project right on their premises. So at that utility's facility, there's a community solar project out front. And we also helped out the small community of Lance in the Upper Peninsula, where they had a project in mind, and we served as technical advisors to them. And Lance also has brought on a project for its community members. But our project came online on January 1, 2019. We did that intentionally so we could qualify for all kinds of tax credits and such in 2019. And as we'd have it, we ended up submitting our project to the Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council, which is a trade organization, member organization in the state of Michigan. And we won Best Project of the Year from that body. We beat out a large wind farm and some other kinds of things. That's a YouTube link. We'll make these slides available to you at the end of the presentation. But you can take a look-see at a really nice video that a young person did for us on a drone. So the construction of our project was a challenge, but we had, as John Sarver knows, plenty of challenges up to that point anyway. So I think it's very fitting that the last dash to get our project up and running at the end of 2018 was a warm spell in East Lansing, and the landfill where we located this project at Bircham Park has a clay cap on it to keep, all the bad stuff underground. And you know what happens when lots of rain lands on clay. We had the muddiest mess you could imagine out there trying to finish up the project, but we got it done. And what led up to that project was an awful lot of other challenges: finding the capital to do the project, finding a tax equity investor to realize some of the tax benefits of the project, getting the city of East Lansing lined up, working with the Lansing Board of Water and Light, who both were great and good partners, but there were things we had to get past, such as zoning ordinances and permitting process and such that were outdated. They'd never tackled a community solar project before in the city of East Lansing. And some of the policies in place really were obstructing, if you will. So one of the things that's happened in the interim, of course, is that a lot of movement has been made to help communities be solar ready, if you will, with their policies and update those. We didn't have that luxury. It took us probably 5 years from concept to finish to get this thing done. And there were times when we thought maybe we weren't going to be able to get it completed. It wasn't going to happen, but we stayed with it. And today, if you go out there, it looks something like this, not on a day like today, but it's a gorgeous garden out there. I thought kind of snarkily that Consumers Energy calls their community solar project solar gardens, but we really have a garden out there. We have purposely planted native pollinators, wildflowers, grasses, and such. You can see milkweed, coreopsis. And the purpose of that was to do habitat restoration on this site. So what used to be a kind of weedy, no-go kind of a location now is really a beautiful natural wild and growing even more wild as we speak, couple acres out of a 20-acre site. In fact, we have a Michigan State student who's doing a study of bees and other kinds of insects as to seeing whether those populations are rebounding thanks to our planting plants out there. The other thing about our doing the pollinators, it wasn't simply for aesthetics or the fact that I'm a greenie. What we did this for in part is because it's much lower maintenance than mowing grass, which is typically what gets put around solar projects. It used to be gravel. They got better than putting gravel around. Now they're putting grass, but the grass needs to be mowed quite often. And there's always a risk if you have lawnmowers and furze choppers out there that somebody's going to nick into the solar array and screw things up. So we only come out there in the late summer, early fall and do one whack, which is also good for these plants as well. Stepping back from our project and looking at the national context, I've been involved with the National Community Solar Partnership from the get-go. I've made presentations there. I'm kind of a technical advisor with them. We've won a couple grants to have some support, including locating community solar at a water facility. And let's talk about that in the discussion period. But the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, which is, a part of the Department of Energy, has really high ambitions for community solar. And the reason we need community solar is that it's a market failure when it comes to rooftop solar. About half of residents and businesses east of the Mississippi have the right kind of roofs for rooftop solar. So they're either pointing not in the right direction, they've got shade, or as many the case, whether you're a resident or a business, you may rent the space. And so you don't own the roof. And so community solar really addresses that constriction of opportunity by saying, okay, we're not going to locate it necessarily on somebody's roof. Let's locate it within the community. Let's locate it on marginal lands. And let's let people be participants in a project where they get virtual credit, if you will, for producing solar power. One of the emphasis of the National Community Solar Partnership is providing information that can be used across the states. Unfortunately, this is showing Alaska and Hawaii. Good. So what we've been doing the last few years in this partnership is basically sharing our intellectual property. We're sharing IP. So if somebody's got a good community solar ordinance that could work for other jurisdictions around the country, you put it out there and let somebody else put it to good use. If you have some ideas about what the best protocol might be to working through your community engagement part of your project, you put it out there and you help each other out. And it's been very successful. It's been very enriching for me to be a part of this. But of course, one of the emphasis as well has been to work on state policy to improve the opportunity for community solar via legislation, via statutes. And this is from 2021, the map. And as you can see, there's not a lot of color on the map. And I don't know if anybody has any immediate reactions to this. You're welcome to turn on your mic and give us your thoughts. But as you can see that there's an awful lot of gray across the state, across the country, and in our state as well. Not surprisingly, the coasts are out ahead of us a little bit on having enabling legislation. We do have one shining example of community solar legislation in the Middle West, and that's the North Star state, that's Minnesota. Minnesota's community solar law came into being, I think, around 2016, thereabouts. And I think these maps are reflecting what was reality maybe in 2018, so there's even more solar projects in place. And these are solar projects that are owned by the utilities. And just like in Michigan, they've got three kinds of utilities in Minnesota. They've got the investor-owned utilities, they have the cooperatives, and they have the municipal utilities. And as you can see, there's a pretty good representation from all three of these types of utilities around the state. And like I said, these maps are a little bit old. I will tell you that I did find recent update that as of 2022, Minnesota has something like 900 megawatts of community solar projects in place. So almost an entire gigawatt of community solar alone. That's not utility solar. That's not rooftop distributed solar. That's that niche solar we're talking about tonight, community solar. So the question is, does enabling legislation make a difference? Here's Michigan. These are our community solar projects, as far as I know. And I made this map myself. So you can see there's a couple in the UP, Lansing and Marquette, I already mentioned those. Cherryland, which is a cooperative there in the Traverse City area, has got one going. There's a community solar gardens project in Cadillac with consumers. And then if you go down to the left a little bit further, there's one in Allendale for consumers, and there's one in Kalamazoo as well. Both of those happen to be located on university campuses. And then the one in the middle is the Lansing Board of Water and Light. I think I'm about right. I might be missing one or two, but I don't think I'm missing anybody. And the amount of megawatts we have, a few, 3, 4, not very many, not very many at all. So you think about us in Minnesota, and again, almost a gigawatt with legislation that passed in 2016. And here we are in 2023, 24, excuse me. And we have this to show for community solar in our state. Unfortunately, there's a hand up. Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, so I'd like a little differentiation because in Lenawee County, we have 3 small sites that are directly connected to the co-op, and those are owned by individuals in our county. And so is that a community solar because one person owns it, or how do you draw the line between community and something that a local individual financed as a single person?
So your incumbent utility is consumers at Lenawee?
This is under Midwest Energy and Communications.
Oh, this is under Midwest. Yeah,
It's a co-op.
We've worked with Midwest before. Midwest may have a kind of a community solar modest thing going. Now that you mentioned, I might have missed on them, but I think it could also be a case where they are just allowing customers to connect onto the grid. Is there any of this power being used behind the meter?
No, it's 100% on the grid.
Well, they're probably, what they also may be doing is simply they've got an independent power producer, a solar developer, a solar company of some kind that's built a solar array, and they're selling the power to the utility. Then the utility is mixing that power in with the rest of the power they have and rate basing it and selling it to you. That's my guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
these are 1 megawatt systems.
Yeah.
And they're owned by a private individual that lives in the county. And you know, so I just wondered where you draw the line between what's community and what could be a private situation, not an international developer, but a person, you know, a single person.
Right. Well, I know that Harvest Solar, one of our GLREA friends, went around and did, working with Spartan Renewables, a bunch of about 1 megawatt projects that were kind of behind the meter, because that utility wanted to get about 10 meters of small scale. And that's, you know, in terms of utility scale, that's a small size of
Right. And those were done by Harvest Solar.
Yeah. So I
But
think it's part
they're
of
not
that.
they're not behind the meter.
Yeah, no, right. And that's part of what the Spartan Renewable would do. And I think the distinction I would make is that a community solar project has either subscriptions or direct investments from the community members themselves in the project. So it sounds like this might be a case where Harvest built it. There was an individual who was wanting to own it, and they're selling the power to the utility. That would not, to my mind, kind of constitute community. It'd be some kind of variation on that.
Yeah, thank you. That clears it up. I understand.
Yeah, I might have muddled it, but I'll look into it a little bit more, because we do know Harvest well, and I do know that project, the Spartan Renewables. Spartan Renewables, by the way, is a subsidiary of Wolverine Power, which is a wholesale power provider for the cooperative utilities that are down below the bridge.
Yep.
And Spartan Renewables has a project up around the Cadillac area as well. That's kind of a project that their cooperatives can take advantage of. Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
So policy matters, and the pun is intended here. It does matter to have good policy. This is the My Community Solar Alliance that was put together last year, the year before last, a group of nonprofits and environmental groups, including GLREA, Michigan Energy Options, that worked with other interested parties to try to get bills that were written to promote and make community solar a requirement of the investor-owned utilities through the system. I actually, a year or two ago, testified in the Energy Committee on the House side as to the value of having a community solar project or a law in the state. I testified with a couple other people. We were the only three, I think, to speak to that particular committee, and it didn't go anywhere. Well, go ahead a year, and it did get out of the committee at least, but it didn't make it onto the floor enough to become a statute like a lot of other good energy legislation that passed last year. We have an interesting renewable energy siting statute now that would allow large projects to go forward if they pass certain kind of criteria and not have those necessarily kneecapped by local opposition and so on and so forth. And there's some other legislation as well. Why didn't the community solar legislation pass? I don't know. I wasn't in those rooms and having those conversations. I know that it was a real push towards the end of last year. And Sam Singh, many of you know Sam. He's been my guy for years and years in East Lansing, both as, on the House and the Senate side of things, and also the mayor. And they did a really good job getting the legislation passed, but this did not get through that pinch point. I think it's fair to say that the utilities overall are not, when I say utilities, I mean investor-owned utilities, are not favorable to community solar for various reasons, which makes me think this. And one of the things we're having a conversation with around the state with interested parties is that the municipals and cooperatives can do what they want. They're not bound by the energy policy that the IOUs are bound by. They're not regulated by the Michigan Public Service Commission. So I'm hoping that we might be able to have some conversations with the member associations and others who represent the cooperatives and municipalities and say, look, why don't we think about a kind of a community solar in the box kind of way to go about it? So if you have utilities interested in doing this, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could actually provide them a lot of the content they would need to get a project at least looked at through the feasibility lens, and then ideally up and running and have something like that happen. Our projects that we did are all on the municipal level. They were 3 municipals who did it. We have not done anything ourselves with the IOUs because it's a no go. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you, what should the legislation be? What legislation is needed that you were advocating for to make it possible?
Yeah, the House bills, I forget the numbers, but there were a couple House bills that were tie-barred to each other, and John Freeman will probably know these better than I would.
Yeah, it's 4465 and
Yeah.
4464.
And I would say this about those bills: they were well done, because one of the benefits of Michigan not being first in a lot of the clean energy world is that we have the benefit of learning from others. And so those bills were based to some extent on what they'd done in Minnesota, what they'd done in Illinois, and they're also based on a couple bills that were drafted just a couple years ago that didn't go anywhere. So to my mind, the provisions in those bills were about as good as it gets. I really thought they did a good job. One of the issues that those bills faced, I believe, was that that at least half of it, John, or I'm not quite sure that much, but the expectation was that there would be some community-owned, community-driven solar projects versus projects that were community solar that were owned and operated by the utility. And I think that was probably the sticking point.
Well, I think it was 2 sticking points. I think that might be one of them. But I think more fundamentally is that if you open up community solar, then more and more people are able to actually get lower costing energy from community solar, which means that means there's less customers for the investor-owned utilities. And they're trying to hold on to their monopoly as best they can. And they see community solar as would really, decrease their number of clients.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. So, the definitive word on community solar is soon to be here. John Freeman and I, John Sarver was involved, and others, Mark Clevey, Megan Husted, and a number of folks with the GLREA were involved putting together a very comprehensive guidebook we've been working on the last year or so. And it's soon to be published. It'll be a freebie, and it has all kinds of good information about what community solar is, good policy out there, examples of projects in the state of Michigan, and other kinds of very useful information that I strongly encourage people to take a look at and to read. And I guess I would say, about speaking for Michigan Energy Options, is we ain't done yet on this. I don't think GLRA is either. We're going to keep pushing on this idea of community solar. We think it checks a lot of boxes for our communities. And I think there's going to be a continued push on the policy side of things. But also, like I said, there may be some workarounds that could be potentially good to have. Like I said, you looked at that map of Minnesota, there are an awful lot of cooperatives and municipal utilities that are doing community solar. And we have about 4 out of the 7 or 8 projects in the state that fall into that category. I'd like to have further conversations with our cooperative and municipal utilities and see if we can get them to move on this really important niche kind of solar. I mean, it really fills a gap between utility and rooftop. It really serves all kinds of good things at our community level. And I would just make the argument that as we think about our energy regime, and we think more about climate related impacts and weather impacts and things like this, I think the more we can do with resiliency, the better off we are. And I think resiliency begins on the distribution grid. And I think it includes solar and storage, and I think it includes community solar. I think those are really going to be important assets to have going forward. So with that, thank you. Let's have discussion and conversation. Looks like there's some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, John, why don't you stop the screen sharing? It'll be easier to kind of see.
Yeah, good, sir.
Yep.
To go away?
Yeah, if you want to just raise your virtual hand and unmute to ask John a question, and we'll kind of check also what is in the chat also. For first question, anybody? Raise your hand, please. Virtual hand. Maybe Lee's just, Lee, do you have a question? Okay, Dave Curtis. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered, is there a way for community solar to earmark, if that's a good terminology, some of that power for EVs? I know the EVs are coming under scrutiny because they're not selling fast enough, and you know, all of the political crap behind that. But is there a way to say, all right, I've got an EV, he's got 2 EVs, we're using community solar to charge our vehicles, and not that we want a reduction in rates, but we want to make sure that you, if you're the community solar supplier, or if you're the consumers or Edison, that you know, that's what our purpose is. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it did. And I'm going to say with the IOUs, I don't know, but I will say this. When I talk about solar on marginal lands first, which has been a rallying cry of mine for a number of years, I can't think of anything more marginal than parking lot. marginal land, right?
Rich.
In certain, certain,
I just fell asleep, watching the news.
anyways,
Yeah,
can,
I'm just kind of tired today.
mute
but
anybody,
yeah,
John?
I'm okay.
Can you mute anybody? Can you
Yeah,
mute Richard?
So how are you, baby?
Richard, can you mute your?
John, you can mute him, John.
Yeah.
It's just saying chat or pin. It's not giving me a choice to mute. Can one of you guys? Maybe he's frozen. Anyway,
Oh, neat.
nope,
Oh,
it's not
great.
frozen.
Yeah.
Come on, John.
A main activity I did, today,
John Freeman, you're the host, so you're the
Somebody
only
muted
one
him.
who
Good.
can mute.
Nicely done. So anyway, here's my vision. We put solar parking canopies up somewhere. We have we have EV chargers at those solar canopies. We use those EV chargers with bidirectional meters. I see Alan there. Hey, Alan. And we also then think about making that whole array something that the community can invest in and have a part of. So I think that to me is a great kind of solution. It checks a number of boxes. So you're putting your marginal land to good use. You're allowing a community solar project to happen, if you will. You're charging EVs. You're providing grid benefits because you could have bidirectional meters, and in certain circumstances you might be taking that and doing different things with that electricity when you need it over peak demand. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for those kinds of clever solutions that's going to make the value of community solar that much more than it already is. Because again, the modern way we should be thinking about our energy is not making sure that we have a base load that can meet any kind of potential demand we have, but rather to have a smart system in which we're going to be able to tell when the demand is coming and call on those local assets to answer to it.
Yeah, John, one thing that you said several times in your presentation was you said we have a distribution system. And the more we tell people that that distribution system can also be a collection system, then we start to break the back of the old adage, bigger the better, and that we got to build a big power plant with big wires coming from it, when in fact we could build in many, many places and use it as a collection system. So if the Public Service Commission wants to improve the infrastructure, that should be one of the rules, that every improvement that's done in a substation has to make it capable of being both distribution and collection, because there may be some subtleties, but the cheapest thing to do is to tie into a existing rural substation and not have to do any other infrastructure.
Absolutely. Yep.
Your
And the other thing about,
comment-
the distribution grid is, I mean, the physics of electricity is that, you open up resistance and it's going to go to where there's the least resistance, right? So renewable energy on the distribution grid is going to stay within that distribution grid. I mean, it isn't going to go out onto the transmission lines and go somewhere else. It's going to be a real local asset. That's why providing ways for people to get involved, like local investment, like, green funds and those kinds of things, is really important, because it's really, I think it should be thought of in the context of how we think of other local assets and benefits we have, such as our urban parks, our museums and all these other kinds of things. We should be thinking of this as something akin to that. And hey, by the way, it also is going to provide us clean energy.
Does anyone?
John, why don't you go ahead, and then Eli? Go ahead, John.
My only comment is that the Public Service Commission doesn't try and oppose things on the utilities unless they have legislative authority to do so. And that's the problem, is that because we don't have a statute in state law that says that the utilities must work with third-party developers on developing community solar projects, as John pointed out earlier, they just don't want to do it. And the Public Service Commission will not force that issue, unfortunately. So that's why we need to get a statute enacted.
Go ahead, Eli.
This is John actually just probably answered my question, John Freeman, because that's what I wanted to hear. Apart from delving into these laws 4465 and 4464, what's the gist that the legislation should mandate? And it looks like Mr. Freeman just answered. The investor-owned utilities should not be able to veto communities' decision to build community solar. Is that right? Just to confirm.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, the idea is that the grid is a community, is an asset that all the ratepayers in Michigan essentially own, and that the utilities should not be a barrier towards expanding solar through community solar to everybody. And that, but unfortunately, the way we work in the state of Michigan and all states, that if you want to promote a new policy, that you, more often than not, you have to get it enacted. In other words, there's, as John Kinch pointed out, there's nothing stopping DTE or consumers from voluntarily working with third-party developers to put together true community solar. Nothing that says they can't do it if they want to, but they simply don't want to do it. And so therefore we have no choice but to enact legislation that's going to enshrine that policy. And there are now 23 states in the country that have a community solar law, and Maryland is the most recent one, and they enacted one in 2023. And so, you know, we're going to try and do it this year while the Democrats have control of the House and the Senate and the governorship.
And John, let me say something to the notion of, and I see Lee's hands up, volume, because for folks who don't know everything about GLREA, we have really strong, with John Freeman and John Richter and others, policy chops and work to intervene regarding utility rate cases and so on and so forth. The two large investor-owned utilities, DT and Consumers, have 80% of the market, thereabouts, probably.
Yeah.
We've got some other utilities, investor-owned utilities in the state as well. Indiana, Michigan Power, a couple others, but they have a small percentage of the pie. So the cooperatives and municipal utilities have roughly 15% of the market between them. We have 66 utilities in the state of Michigan, 66 utilities. So that means we have a dozen cooperatives thereabouts. We have about 40 some municipal utilities. How come 40 some municipal utilities around the state of Michigan don't have some kind of community solar project going right now? They could. They wouldn't have to ask permission to anybody. They could do it. They're not doing it. So while I appreciate gunning for the big guys, the IOUs and all the rest, and having a statute and having legislation and having the enforcement of the MPSC and the regulations, we should be absolutely doing that as well. At least for a little while now, I'm going to be training my thoughts and attentions on the munis, because I think they could lead by example. And frankly, last time I checked, most of their missions are to serve their communities, not to serve their shareholders.
Go ahead, Lee.
So why aren't they doing it, would you say?
It's $1 million question. I think
we
a couple reasons. I think I'll say two reasons. One, and at least in the utility world in the state of Michigan, the munis and co-ops kind of hang back and see what the IOUs are doing. Sometimes they kind of follow along, you know. So there's that piece of it, I think, is there. I think one of the other issues is that we have some of these utilities, many of these utilities are connected to wholesale power providers. The Michigan Public Power Association, MPPA, which is a good group. So they go out and they buy wholesale power here and there. They've got they've got some large solar projects in Michigan that they're invested in, and they're doing that kind of thing, which is great. More power to them. But I think for a lot of the smaller municipal utilities, that just kind of takes care of the problem for them, and getting something on their distribution grid and in town and getting past all the hurdles, and having local community members coming to open houses and meetings and arguing about whether this is a good thing or not isn't just something they want to get involved with. I don't know. What do you think, Freeman and Sarver?
I think part of the problem with the municipals and co-ops too is you have people who have what I'll call a traditional utility perspective, which is basically, we either buy power or produce power and sell it to our customers. This idea of a kind of a community-based production and bill credits that you have to kind of put on your customers' bills. It's just not a traditional way of doing business. And so there has been leadership, obviously, Cherryland, Lansing Board of Water and Light. But I think part of the problem has and still is that even folks who are doing municipals and co-ops, have the utility managers have kind of a traditional approach. And that's, hopefully we'll get them on board with the advantages of this approach. Lee, go ahead.
I'll say the same thing as you just said in another way. It's generational.
Yep.
But there is another subtle thing. I think in Michigan, we don't feel as much pain when the price of a kilowatt goes up to 40 cents on some summer afternoon. I was at a 12 megawatt battery installation in Bowling Green, Ohio. They did a ribbon cutting. And the developer there said, I'm looking for another place to put a battery along with some solar. And I said, well, I'm from Michigan. You want to talk to me? And he said, oh, no, Michigan, I can't afford to do that. So I thought, he said, the price doesn't vary enough. So I came home and looked up the capacity of the pump storage facility in Ludington compared to this battery system in Bowling Green, Ohio, which is on PJM instead of MISO. And of course, that battery system was 7 megawatts, 12 megawatt hours. And Ludington is 1,800 megawatts and 19,500 megawatt hours. So those municipal systems, they're not used to paying 40 cents a kilowatt and selling it for 20. Okay, on those hot summer days. So they don't think they have to take care of anything on their own. They just keep buying power at a higher than normal rate, but never painfully.
Thanks, Lee. David, go ahead. Oh, you're muted. Yep.
Okay, yes, I've got two questions. First, what are the opportunities for political action and political advocacy along the lines of last year's Clean Energy Future Plan? And secondly, what is the applicability of an idea like this to a condominium complex or an apartment complex?
Let me take the second one first, and I'm going to punt the first one to John Freeman. HOAs are an interesting situation here in Michigan. Recently, something passed, right, that was saying that HOAs can't ban rooftop solar, I believe, which is good. I mean,
it wasn't passed, but it was introduced.
Okay, and that's heading in the absolute.
No, it actually passed the House and it's sitting in the Senate now. So.
Okay, thank you. That's absolutely heading, I mean, in the wrong direction. HOA should be saying, wait a minute, we've got a bunch of shared space, roofs in common that belong to the co-op, or belong to the co-op, belong to the HOA, the condo association. You own everything from the drywall in, so that's our property up there. There's no reason in the world we shouldn't be blanketing those roofs with solar power and figuring out ways to credit our local residents with that power. The other thing was like find some place on that HOA property where you're not using it so much. Maybe you have just a little less lawn you got to cut every year, and you put solar there and put it into your panels. Now, here's the thing. In the state of Michigan, you cannot cross a property line with power. So if I have a solar array over here and I cross a property line and plug it in over here to use it, that's a problem. At least in the IOU's turf, you can't do that. So there's a lot of things like that that are also a problem. And also the other thing would be, well, you have to be grid connected with that system, and then it gets on the distribution grid. Then at that point, that local incumbent utility, they got to say, they can say, hell no, we don't want that. Or maybe we want that, or we're going to hit you with a distribution charge. We're going to do all kinds of things like that. That said, there's some new technologies coming out there, which are really cool, which allow a community solar or a solar array of any kind to basically pretty seamlessly go from there and plug right into a master meter, if you will. You can then do all kinds of cool things with that meter wirelessly, so you can give credit to those participants in the project. So there's definitely some technological solutions coming out there. We're looking at these, especially with the idea of multifamily, right? Renters. So how do you credit somebody in a multifamily apartment complex kind of system if there's solar on the roof? How do you work all that out? Well, there's some solutions that I think are much more local and smart that I think will give us a chance to have workarounds. But again, it's going to have everything to do with your incumbent utility. So even if you're a co-op or a muni, they could say no to you. And then at that point, you're kind of dead in the water. John, do you want to say something about the other question you asked?
Yeah,
By the way,
real quick.
thanks for that. I appreciated that.
Yeah, the homeowners association bill that John was referencing is 5028. It passed on November 1st, 2023, and it's sitting in the Senate. The problem now in the legislature is that we don't have control of the House from now until April, because we had a 56-54 control, but then two Democrats ran for mayors, Warren and in Westland. So now it's 54-54 in the House. So nothing's going to pass the House because no Republican will support the bills. So right now we're in a holding pattern in the House until April. Now we're hoping that the Senate, under again Sam Singh's leadership, will take up the community solar bills that are currently in the Senate. And Jeff Irwin has one bill, and then Ed McBroom has the other bill. So we're hoping that they'll get a hearing in the Senate Energy Committee, pass the Senate, and then when the Democrats take control of the House again in late April, then those bills will shoot over to the House, and hopefully we'll get them action in the House. The House did hold a hearing in late October, early November on the two House bills for community solar. So that's the current political situation right now.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have expected anything to pass any sooner than this spring anyway. But when it comes up for a vote, before that happens, it would be great to have some real political action on
Absolutely.
that part. I head up an organization called Washtenaw Climate Reality. It's the Climate Reality chapter, that we have locally. Climate Reality Project is Al Gore's group, and we're always looking for opportunities to engage on something like that. And we're ready to go. Give us the direction.
I mean, just like last year, I sent out numerous emails about the renewable energy, and I encouraged the GLREA members to send emails and make phone calls. As we tee up community solar, I will be, sending out emails about that as well. But why don't we call upon our last person with the question, John Sarver. Gilbran has got a question.
Hey, Jabron, hey, how you doing?
Hey, Jabron, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, John. Question, I would say, is this something you're going to include? Is like when you give that playbook for municipals, did you also maybe we think about coming up with a playbook for like how to organize structure, as far as hiring? Because you can imagine, like, I'm just in Detroit and how like that old guard, how would you hire and repopulate so that you actually have the people in place to like be able to like implement it, so you're not kind of like not sure, It's like they almost need a playbook for how to make their utilities more like in the current, the future, whether it's like the the talent and just the staffing, the community engagement, outreach. I mean, I think it looks a lot different than like you said, like the old utility.
Yeah.
And they probably need help on that, like what type of people should you be putting in that office or that department as you try to like implement community solar? Because I can imagine if it passes legislation, they won't necessarily. I mean, yeah, the orgs on the ground floor, we'd be ready to go and move and come up with projects, but the municipals that have
Yeah.
the car won't know how to like, okay, this is how we should be building out the staffing to do this future, community
Yeah.
solar and parking lots and battery and even
So
the financing part, yeah.
It's a great question, Jabron. It's generational. I oftentimes, you can't repeat that I said this to you, but I oftentimes joke that the fossil plants are closing, but the fossils are still in charge to some extent. So it's going to be generational change. And my best example of that is Brandy Ekman. Brandy was at the Lansing Board of Water and Light for years. She was chief counsel there. I thought she was going to end up becoming the CEO of BWL, which is a pretty progressive municipal utility. They're doing a lot of good solar things and so on and so forth. But she didn't do that. She ended up leaving and going to Traverse City. And I mentioned that we just completed a Traverse City Light and Power Climate Action Plan with Five Lakes Energy and others. That utility has municipal utilities, very ambitious goals about decarbonizing not only their own operations, but decarbonizing all the energy consumption in Traverse City. You should take a look at what they have to do. And Brandy's younger and she's a woman, and there's something to be said about that. So I think some of this change is going to happen by just having younger people at the helm. That I think they're not going to be satisfied with the way they've done things in the past. They're not going to be looking backward to understand the future. They're going to be saying, where are these opportunities and what should we be doing now to look out for what we can look out for? I always say that one of the beauties of thinking very hard about the distribution grid is that you hedge what you can hedge and you can control what you can control. So you've got control that you can do some things there that you can't do otherwise. And I think that's just a smart move to be making in these uncertain times with risks from climate change becoming even greater and unknown.
I think one advantage we'll have after we get legislation passed, and I say after because I'm real confident that we'll get there, is we have people in the state like John Kinch who have actually done projects and can kind of advise other people, like has been asked, how do you get started, or what are the steps you need to go through. John heading up a Michigan nonprofit can be a tremendous resource once we get the legislation passed, and the guidebook too, for that matter. We're getting close to 8 o'clock. Debbie, you get the last question.
And you just set me up for it. I'm wondering, how can I get my hands on some of those guidebooks?
John Freeman, when's the guidebook coming out? Do you know?
I can't tell you exactly. We have Megan Husted and she and I are working on making final edits. We're getting close to having the guidebook be final, but then we have to get it graphically designed. And currently it's about an 80-page guidebook. So it's going to take a bit of time to get it graphically designed. But I would imagine probably by the end of February, it will be ready. We will have a specific solar story or renewable energy seminar on the guidebook. I did 3 webinars with State of Michigan for local units of government, where I talked about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of the guidebook. And so we're going to do the same thing for the GLREA membership. So stay tuned.
And let's see, it's 8 o'clock. Thank you, John, for a great presentation. Thank you for all of you for participating and asking such good questions. And, I think we're going to be turning the page in this area, hopefully very soon. And we'll really, maybe we'll catch up to Minnesota.
Thanks, John. You did an excellent job, and I really appreciated hearing all this. Thanks. Take care. Janice Means.
Thanks, Janice. Nice to hear you.
Thanks, everybody. And
thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Appreciate your time.